He never insulted her. He never touched her. He simply moved her ink 1 inch to the left and waited to see if she would notice. She did. That was the beginning of everything. Our story starts now. The Legal Codification Division lived 4 floors beneath the atrium, in a corridor where the enchanted windows had been set, decades ago, to a permanent grey autumn. Nobody remembered who had chosen it. Nobody had ever bothered to change it. Hermione Granger had worked there for 6 years, and she'd come to depend on that particular weather the way other people depended on tea. Rain on glass that opened onto nothing, the soft, granular hiss of it, a sky the colour of wet slate that never brightened and never quite gave way to dark. She arrived at 7. She always arrived at 7. By 10 past, the lamps along her desk had been coaxed to the exact amber she preferred, low enough not to glare on parchment, high enough to catch the copper plate of her own handwriting. By 1/4 past, her inkwells stood in their line, black, red, and the deep violet she used for marginalia, spaced a thumb's width apart, stoppers turned so the little glass facets caught the light identically. It was not vanity. It was not even superstition, though it lived in the same house as superstition. It was simply that a woman who had spent a year sleeping in a tent with her wand under her cheek learned to build small kingdoms wherever she could and to keep their borders. The memorandum had come on Friday. She had read it twice, folded it, and set it beneath a paperweight, where it stayed all weekend like something that might go off. Effective Monday, D.L. Malfoy transfers from Wizengamot Archives to Legal Codification at the request of the head of department. Desk assignment 4B. 4B faced her own. 6 feet of scuffed parquet between them, no partition, nothing but a shared strip of floor and the long grey mouth of the false window. She had not slept especially well. He came at 10 to 8, which she noted, and which annoyed her that she had noted. There was no announcement. The door gave its familiar dry cough of a hinge, and he was simply there, carrying a single case of tooled black leather, dressed in charcoal wool without a single thread out of place, and the whole room seemed to draw one careful breath and hold it. Hermione did not look up. She turned a page she had already read. Granger. His voice had changed since the war. It had lost the whine that used to ride under it, that adolescent drag of a boy who expected the world to be handed over unearned. What was left was quieter and considerably worse. Low, unhurried, entirely without heat. Malfoy. She still did not look up. Your desk is the one with the broken drawer. The left one sticks. You have to lift as you pull. Thank you. That was all. He crossed to 4B, set down his case, and began to unpack it with the unhurried economy of a man laying out surgical instruments. Quills. A blotter. A silver-topped inkwell. A slim volume of statutory commentary, its spine cracked white with use. She saw that and hated that she saw it, because a cracked spine meant a book that had been read rather than owned. She waited for it. All morning, she waited. She waited through the 11 o'clock post, when the memo planes came in their squall of violet paper, and one clipped her shoulder, and she swore under her breath. She waited through the interminable meeting on subsection 9, where Perkins from enforcement talked for 20 minutes about a point she had settled in writing 3 months earlier. She waited. while the rain that was not rain slid down the glass of the window that opened onto nothing. The insult never came. That was the first thing that unsettled her, and it unsettled her far more than any insult could have. She had prepared for the other. She had a whole architecture ready for it. 6 years of anticipated ripostes, arranged and dusted, a defense built so long ago that its stones had gone smooth. She had never once considered what she would do if the enemy simply sat down at his desk and worked. Because he worked. God, he worked. At 1:30 she went to fetch the Ferrenby file and found that he had already cross-referenced it, in a hand so fine and even it might have been printed, with 3 precedents she had missed. Not missed. Not quite. 2 of them she had discarded as tangential. The 3rd she had genuinely missed, and it was better than anything she had. And there it sat in cool black ink with a page reference and a date, offered without comment, without a note, without so much as an initial in the margin to claim it. She stood over the file for a long moment with her jaw set. Then she took it back to her desk and used it, because she was not a child. The afternoon wore itself thin. Somewhere above them, a lift shuddered in its shaft, and the whole floor gave a low, sympathetic groan. The lamps hissed. Across the 6 feet of parquet, a quill moved and stopped, and she found that she had begun to hear the silences between the strokes more clearly than the strokes themselves. Twice she caught herself watching the tendon shift in the back of his hand. Both times she looked down so quickly that her own nib bit the parchment and left a small black wound in the middle of a clause about grazing rights. At 6, he rose, folded his cuffs down, fastened them, and inclined his head perhaps 1/4 of an inch. Granger. Malfoy. The door coughed shut. She sat in the yellow pool of her lamp, with her shoulders coming slowly down from somewhere near her ears, and she thought, that is going to be perfectly manageable then. She worked until 8:30. When at last she stood and stretched until something in her spine gave a small, clean click, she reached for the shelf behind her desk to return the Ferrenby commentary to its place. Her hand stopped in the air. The shelf ran the whole length of the wall behind her chair. 4 ranks of it, 30-odd years of accumulated statute and treatise and departmental minutes, and every volume of it arranged according to a system that was entirely and unapologetically her own. Not alphabetical, not chronological. She had ordered those books by the density of their citation in her own working papers. The ones she reached for hourly at her right hand, then the ones she needed weekly, then monthly, then the great dead weight of the ones she kept only because a decent lawyer kept them. It was a system nobody else could read. It was a system nobody else needed to read. She had built it over 6 years, one reshuffle at a time, until she could put her hand on any spine in the dark without lifting her eyes from the page in front of her. It was alphabetical now, by author, perfectly, beautifully. Without a single volume out of True, the spines flush to a finger breadth. The tall folios of Abercrombie's precedents leading like soldiers into Bracknell, into Crow, into Dunstan, all the way along to the collected Yarrow at the far end where her weekly reference used to sit. Hermione stood absolutely still. The lamp hissed. Beyond the false glass, the false rain went on, falling out of its unchanging sky, and she became aware of her own heartbeat. as a distinct and separate event, high in her throat, entirely disproportionate to a rearranged bookshelf. There was no note. She looked for one. She lifted 3 volumes and set them down, and looked behind the rank and found nothing. Not a card, not an initial, nothing but the faint, clean smell of old buckram and the dust that had lain undisturbed against the backboard for years, and now lay in a thin, disturbed line where a hand had passed. A hand had passed there. He had stood at her back, at her chair, in the small square of floor she thought of as hers, and he had taken down and put back some 200 volumes without making enough noise for her to notice. And then he had gone to his desk and worked for 8 hours and said nothing at all except Granger twice, once in greeting and once in farewell. She pressed her fingertips very lightly to the edge of the shelf. Her first thought, and she was not proud of it, was that this was a violation and she would report it. Her second was that there was nothing whatever to report. He tidied my books would follow her down that corridor for a decade. Perkins would repeat it at Christmas. Her third thought arrived quietly from underneath and sat down in the middle of her chest. He had not done it badly. That was the splinter. Any fool could have shoved her shelves into disarray. That would have been vandalism, and vandalism she knew how to answer. This was something else. Somebody had spent an hour and more with their head tipped sideways, reading 200 spines, and had done the work with such exactness that not one volume leaned, and had chosen the one arrangement in the world that was objectively defensible and personally insupportable. Alphabetical. The system of a man who could stand in the witness box and say, "I put them in order," and be believed by every soul in the room. He had not touched her. He had not raised his voice. He had walked into the small kingdom she had spent 6 years fortifying, and he had improved it. Hermione let out a breath she had been keeping somewhere behind her sternum. Very deliberately, she reached up and took down Abercrombie. She held the great heavy folio against her hip for a moment, looking along the pale, even rank of spines. And then she began, slowly, and then rather less slowly, to put her shelf back the way it had been. Yarrow to the right hand, the Grazing Rights Digest at eye level. Crow exiled to the top where Crow belonged. Her arms ached by the end of it, and there was dust in the weave of her sleeve, and it took her until nearly 10. When it was finished, she stood back and looked at it, breathing hard, her hair coming loose at the temple, and she understood with perfect clarity 2 things. The first was that he would come in tomorrow, and he would see it, and he would not say one word about it. The second was that she had spent 2 hours of her own life answering him, and in doing so had told him a great deal more about herself than she had ever intended to tell anyone in that department, and that he had known she would. She snuffed the lamps. In the doorway she paused, one hand on the frame, and looked back at the long, dim rank of her books standing in their stubborn, illegible order beneath the window where it was always, always raining. Then she turned out the last light and went home, and she did not sleep well that night either. He said nothing. That was the whole of it, and it was enormous. Tuesday morning she arrived at 7, as always, and by 10 to 8 the door gave its dry cough, and he came in with his case and his cuffs, and the faint, cold smell of the atrium fireplaces still on his coat. And he crossed the parquet, and he passed within a foot of the shelf she had spent 2 hours dismantling and rebuilding by lamplight. And he did not glance at it. Not a flicker, not the smallest deflection of the eye. Hermione, who had positioned herself at her desk with a page of subsection 9 open in front of her and had not read a word of it in 11 minutes, felt something in her chest tighten to a fine wire. Granger. Malfoy. He sat. He unrolled his blotter. The quill began its patient stop and start across the parchment, and the false rain went on running down the false glass in its long grey threads. And that was Tuesday. She got through it by an act of will she would have been ashamed to quantify. It was Wednesday that she noticed the ink. She reached without looking, as she had reached 10,000 times, for the black, first in the rank, nearest her right hand, a thumb's width from the red, and her fingers closed on air and then on cool glass an inch further left than it should have been. The nib in her other hand hovered. She looked down. Black, red, violet, all three still in their line, still evenly spaced, still with their little cut facets turned to catch the lamp. Shifted as a unit, 1 inch to the left of where she had set them. Hermione put her quill down. She sat very still for a moment, with her palms flat on the desk, and she listened to the room. The hiss of the lamps, the tick of the departmental clock that ran 40 seconds fast and always had, the small dry scratch of somebody else's work happening 6 feet away. Then she reached out and moved the inkwells back, one at a time, setting each down with a soft, deliberate click of glass on wood. The quill on the other side of the room did not pause. She looked up. He was writing. His head was bent, the pale hair falling forward and pushed back with 2 fingers in a gesture so unconscious it could not possibly have been performed for anybody. There was a smudge of ink on the side of his left hand, the way there always is on the hand of somebody who writes fast and left across the page. He looked like a man who had never in his life thought about her ink bottles. Very well, Hermione thought. On Thursday, it was 2 inches, and towards her. On Friday, the violet had changed places with the red. By the following Wednesday, she had begun to measure. She was not proud of this either. She had taken a strip of card and marked it in pencil. 3 small ticks, 1 for each stopper. And every evening before she left, she laid the card down and aligned them. And every morning at 7, she laid the card down again. And every morning the ticks and the glass had come apart by some fraction that varied, maddeningly, with no pattern she could extract. 1 inch, half an inch, a hair. Once, on a Monday, nothing at all, and she had stood there in the lamplight for a full half-minute with the card in her hand, feeling something that was almost certainly not disappointment. That was the day she understood the shape of what he was doing, and it made the back of her neck go hot. Because there was no accusation possible. That was the architecture of the thing. If she went to Robards and said, "He moves my ink," she would hear it aloud in the same breath as saying it, and she would see Robards's face, and the story would be in the tea room by 4 and in the Prophet's gossip column by the weekend. Granger loses grip over stationery. If she said it to Malfoy himself, if she crossed those 6 feet of parquet and said, "Stop touching my desk," he would look up with those cool grey eyes and say, "I beg your pardon," and she would have to stand there and elaborate. She would have to say the words 1 inch aloud to his face in a working office and watch him receive them with courteous incomprehension. He had found the one act in the world that could not be reported and could not be endured. And still, he was flawless. That was the part that sounded her raw. She could have borne it from a slacker. She could have taken it to the head of department wrapped in a fortnight of missed deadlines. But his work came in early and came in immaculate. He read the drafting instructions she wrote and improved them. He caught a numbering error in a schedule that had survived 3 rounds of review, and he did not announce the catch. He simply corrected it in a marginal note in his fine, even hand, and passed it back with the corrections so lightly made that a careless reader might have thought it had always been right. She was forced to concede somewhere around the 2nd week, the best drafter she had ever worked beside, including herself. And there were days when the two of them worked the same statute from opposite ends and met in the middle with the joins so clean you could not find them with a fingernail. Those days were the worst. Those were the days she went home and sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow and thought about the tendon at the back of his hand. The article came in the 3rd week. The subsection 9 meeting had gone the way subsection 9 meetings always went. Perkins from enforcement, with his thumbs in his waistcoat, explaining to her at length that the hybrid creature standing provisions were, and he used this word, sentimental. 11 people around a long scarred table under a chandelier that had been enchanted to burn green and made everybody look faintly seasick. Hermione had made her argument. She had made it well. She always made it well. She had made it 3 times before in that room to those people and watched it go into the minutes and die there. "With respect," Perkins said, in the voice of a man who meant none. "It's an interesting theory, but nobody's ever actually made the case that legal personality can attach on a graduated basis. It's not in the literature." And from the far end of the table, without heat, without haste, without so much as lifting his eyes from the page in front of him, "It's in Granger." The room turned. Standing at the threshold, graduated legal personality in part human populations, Draco said. Journal of Comparative Magical Jurisprudence, Spring of 3, pages 409 to 441. He turned a page. "The question is not whether a being possesses personhood entire, but whether the law is capable of the modest humility required to recognize it in degrees." She then sets out a 4-stage test at page 422, which has been cited in 11 subsequent papers and, I believe, twice in the Wizengamot. It is very much in the literature, Perkins. You've simply not read it. Nobody breathed. Hermione sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her and her heart going like a hammer on tin. And she watched Perkins's mouth open and shut, and she thought, with a violence that shocked her, how dare you? Because he had quoted her, word perfect. Not paraphrased, quoted, with a page, with a year, with a small, awkward clause about modest humility that she had agonized over for 2 days, and had, in the end, been faintly embarrassed by ever since. That paper was 22 years old at the time of writing, and nobody had ever read it. Nobody. It had been cited 11 times, and she knew every one of the 11 by heart, and could recite what they had got wrong. And now this man. This man who moved her ink an inch and reordered her books, and had once, in another life, watched her bleed on a drawing room floor, had sat at the far end of a green-lit table and produced her own sentence out of his mouth as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and had used it to win her argument for her. Not with her, for her. The motion carried. Subsection 9 went forward. It was the first time in 3 years, and she should have been elated. She got out of that room as fast as decency permitted, and stood in the corridor with one hand against the cold stone and her eyes shut, and her pulse would not come down. He came out 4 minutes later. He did not stop. He passed her with a folder under his arm and the faint, dry rustle of good wool, and she heard herself say, in a voice pitched low and shaking with something she could not name, "How do you know that paper?" He stopped then. He turned. In the corridor light, that thin institutional green, the grey of his eyes had gone almost colourless. "You published it," he said. "Was it meant to be a secret?" "It has 11 citations, Malfoy, in 22 years. 12, he said. She stared at him. "What?" 12 citations. A pause, no longer than a heartbeat. "There's a note at footnote 16 of the Wizengamot Archive's 2004 report on part-human petitions. Unsigned. Archival staff don't sign." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere above them, a lift began its long, shuddering climb. "You!" Hermione stopped. Her hand had gone up, entirely without her permission, and was smoothing the cuff of her sleeve. She realized it, and made it stop, and it started again on the other wrist. "That was 2 years before you... before I... what? Before you transferred here." She lifted her chin. "You cited me 2 years ago." "I cited a correct proposition of law," he said, "correctly attributed. It's not an act of devotion, Granger. It's basic scholarship." He shifted the folder to his other arm. "Perkins hasn't read a journal since he was 30. Somebody had to shut him up, and you were doing it far too politely." "I didn't ask you to fight my..." "No," he agreed. "You didn't." And then he waited. That was the unbearable thing. He simply stood there in the green corridor light and waited with perfect courtesy for her to finish a sentence she had no ending for, and she stood there with her fingers on her own cuff and could not produce one, because the true ending of it was, "I didn't ask you to read me." And that was not a sentence she could say aloud to Draco Malfoy in a ministry corridor at 11:30 on a Thursday morning. "Was there anything else?" he asked. "No?" "Then congratulations on subsection 9. He inclined his head that same 1/4 inch. "It should have gone through in 4. He walked away. She listened to his footsteps go down the corridor and turn the corner and thin out into the general hum of the building. And she stood with her palm flat against cold stone for a long time afterwards. That evening, she did not lay the penciled card down beside her inkwells. She looked at it in the amber pool of the lamp, with the office empty around her and the rain sliding endlessly down the window that opened onto nothing. Then she opened the drawer and put it inside and shut the drawer. And instead, she reached out and moved the black inkwell herself, 1 inch to the left, exactly the width of her own thumb, and set it down with a small, clear click. She sat back and looked at what she had done. Her heart was going far too fast for a woman alone in an office with a bottle of ink, and she knew perfectly well that in the morning he would see it, and she knew perfectly well that he would understand. And she found that she was gripping the arms of her chair hard enough to feel the grain of the wood under her fingers. She stood up, seized her coat, and left the building without looking back at the desk once. He answered on Thursday, not with the ink. The ink she found on arriving at 7, with her pulse already unhelpfully high, had not been touched at all. The black stood exactly 1 inch to the left where she had put it, its facets throwing the same small amber sparks they had thrown when she left, and the red and the violet held their line behind it like 2 soldiers refusing to comment. He had let it stand. He had come in, seen the thing she had done, and left it exactly as she made it. Hermione sat down and discovered that her hands were not entirely steady, and told herself firmly that this was the coffee. The memo came at 9. It arrived the ordinary way, folded into its violet plane, banking twice around the lamp before settling on her blotter with the small papery sigh they made when the charm let go. Departmental stationery. His hand, that fine, even copper plate, the ascenders slightly forward-leaning, the whole thing laid out with the margins ruled by eye and true to a hair. Granger, attached, the redraft of Clause 14 with the Ferrenby point folded in at 3b. I have left the transitional provisions alone. They are yours, and I would not presume. One query. At 5, do we want shall or must? Precedent is divided. They're both defensible. DM. She read it twice, then she read it a third time, more slowly, with the top of her spine going very still. Your for yours, there for there. 2 errors in a memorandum of 41 words from a man who had produced, that same week, an 11-page schedule with not 1 comma out of place. From a man who had recited her own footnote from 22 years back with the page reference attached. From a man whose marginal corrections were so exact that she had twice checked his Latin against the digest and twice found herself the one at fault. He had misspelled yours, deliberately, beautifully, in the very sentence in which he declined to touch her work. Hermione put the memorandum down on her blotter and placed both palms flat on either side of it, and for perhaps 10 seconds she did nothing at all. The lamp hissed. Across the 6 feet of parquet, the quill went on with its patient stopping and starting. The false rain came down the false glass. She wanted, with an intensity that frightened her a little, to laugh. She did not laugh. She reached instead for the red inkwell, second in the rank, where it had been for 6 years, and unstoppered it and dipped and drew a single clean line through your, and wrote above it in her own upright hand, yours. Then the second, there struck through, there above it. Then, at the foot of the page, in letters no larger than the rest, but pressed rather harder into the parchment than her usual habit. Shall. Precedent is not divided. Perkins is merely confused, which is a different condition. C. Crow, 3rd edition, page 88. Top shelf, right hand, since you'll be looking. H.G. She folded it. She set the charm. And then, because to send it back by plane, banking twice around his lamp with the whole department watching, was an act she was not yet prepared to perform in public. She stood up, crossed the parquet in 6 strides, and laid it face down on the corner of his blotter. He did not look up. His quill did not falter. But she was standing close enough to see the pale hair at his temple and the ink on the edge of his left hand, and she saw the tendon in his wrist go tight and hold for the space of one breath before it eased. "Thank you," he said to the page. "You're welcome," said Hermione, with a precision that could have cut glass, and went back to her desk. She got no useful work done for an hour and a half. The notes did not stop. They multiplied. A memorandum on Friday. You're correct about the Ferrenby point. A note left under the paperweight on Monday. It's in the second box, not the third. I checked twice, which is more than you did. A margin annotation on a draft schedule, in a hand so exquisite it should have been engraved on brass. This is your best paragraph. Do not let Perkins near it. Each of them otherwise flawless. Each of them containing one, never two, after the first, small deliberate wound. And every single one came back to him in red, corrected, initialed, with a line at the bottom that grew, week by week, less like a rebuke and more like a conversation. Crow, 3rd edition. And than, not then, unless you meant to imply a sequence, which would be a very odd thing to imply about a box. It is its when possessive, and its when contracted. You know this. You knew it at 11. I watched you sneer at Crabbe for getting it wrong. You have now made this error 4 times. I am beginning to suspect a pattern, which would be an extraordinary thing for a man of your precision. That last one she nearly did not send. She held it for 6 minutes with her thumb pressed into the corner of the parchment until the fibres went soft and furred, and she thought, this is the moment where you name it, and once it is named, it either dies or it becomes something else. She sent it. His reply came within the hour. 2 lines, and for the first time not one error in either of them. I have never in my life made an error 4 times. DM Hermione read that, alone at her desk at 4 in the afternoon, and felt the whole floor of her stomach drop away like a trap door. It was, she realized, the closest thing to a confession she had ever been offered by anybody, and it had been made in 9 words, and it admitted absolutely nothing that could be quoted against him. October went on. The false window ran with false rain, and the departmental clock lost its 40 seconds and gained them back, and the 2 of them wrote the best statute the Legal Codification Division had produced in a decade. That was the part nobody could see. From the outside, from the tea room, from Perkins's chair, from the general drift of the corridor, the story was simply that Granger and Malfoy worked well together, coldly and professionally, and were not to be interrupted after 4 o'clock. What nobody saw was the traffic, the violet planes going back and forth across 6 feet of parquet a dozen times a day, the paper accumulating, her red ink running out twice in a month when a bottle had used to last her a term. What nobody saw was that they had stopped speaking almost entirely. She noticed it at the end of the 3rd week, and it stopped her cold. Days went by, in which they exchanged nothing but Granger and Malfoy, morning and evening, like 2 bells struck at opposite ends of a church. Everything else, every argument about drafting, every concession, every joke, and there were jokes now, dry as salt, and buried 3 clauses deep where only she would find them, happened on paper, in 2 hands, in 2 colours. They had built a language. She had helped build it. She had picked up the trowel herself with that first red correction, and she had been laying courses ever since. And the terrible, glittering fact at the centre of it was this: he never once wrote a word he could not have justified to a disciplinary panel. Not one. She had gone back through the whole accumulated pile. She kept them, that was the other thing. She kept every one in the second drawer under the departmental minutes, and read them straight through one evening in the empty office. And there was nothing there, nothing improper, nothing warm, nothing a man could be reprimanded for. Just 40-odd memoranda about statutory construction from an exceptional colleague, riddled with errors he had never made in his life. He was writing to her in a code that only she could read, and he had built it so that if she ever chose to walk away from it, there would be no evidence that anything had happened at all. He had made himself deniable. He had made himself safe to refuse. Hermione sat in the lamplight with the pile in her lap and her thumb moving slowly over the furred corner of the oldest note, and understood that this was not a game. It was an act of extraordinary cowardice, or an act of extraordinary courtesy, and she had absolutely no idea which, and she suspected that he did not either. On the last Friday of the month, she stayed late, and so did he. It was not arranged. Nothing between them was ever arranged. The floor emptied at 6, as it always did, the lamps dimming rank by rank down the corridor. And by 7 there was nothing left in the legal codification division but 2 desks burning amber 6 feet apart, and the endless soft granular hiss of weather that did not exist. At 8:30, she reached the end of a clause, set down her quill, and pressed the heels of both hands against her eyes. "There's tea," he said. She dropped her hands. It was the first thing either of them had said aloud since 10 to 8 that morning, and it sounded shockingly loud and shockingly ordinary. "What?" "Tea." He had not looked up. "In the pot. It's been there 20 minutes. It's still drinkable for another 5 at a generous estimate, and you have not moved in an hour and 40 minutes, which even by your standards is... You've been timing me." "I have been sitting 6 feet away from you," said Draco, "and I have ears." She got up. She went to the side table where the departmental pot sat under its charm, and she found 2 cups set out, and she stood there for a moment with her hand around the warm china, and something moving in her chest that she did not have a name for and did not want one. She poured 2. She brought his to his desk and set it down at his right hand, not on the blotter on the wood, because he kept his blotter clear, and she knew that now she knew 100 things now. And he said, "Thank you," to the page, as he always did. But this time, as she turned, his hand came up for the cup, and hers had not quite gone, and the edge of his knuckle went across the inside of her wrist. It lasted less than a second. It was nothing. It was the accident of 2 people and 1 cup in a narrow space. Hermione stood absolutely still in the amber light, with her wrist burning as though something had been written on it, and she watched his hand, that hand, the tendon, the ink stain on the outer edge, close around the china, and go very carefully, very deliberately, entirely still. He did not look up. He did not look up, and he did not breathe, and neither did she, and the departmental clock ticked 40 seconds fast into the silence between them. Then Hermione took 1 step back and another, and returned to her own desk, and picked up her quill with fingers that were not steady at all, and wrote 3 words on the parchment in front of her before she realized she had written them, and struck them out with such force that the nib tore the page. The biscuits came up from the 3rd floor kitchens every Wednesday in a tin with a dented lid, and by 11 o'clock there were generally 2 left, and by 11:30, 1. Hermione had a system for the last one. Everybody in the legal codification division had a system for the last one. Perkins's was to take it at 9:10, like a man stealing horses. Mafalda's was to break it in half and leave the other half, which was worse than taking the whole thing, and everybody knew it. Hermione's was to wait. She waited until 11, and then went down the corridor at an unhurried pace, with a file under her arm so that it looked like an errand, and she took the last biscuit, and she ate it standing at the window that looked out onto the same grey nothing as all the others, and it was the single most reliable pleasure of her week. On the 2nd Wednesday in November, she came round the corner of the tea-room door at 11 precisely, and stopped. He was standing at the tin. He had the lid in one hand and the last biscuit in the other, held between 2 fingers, and he was not eating it. He was simply holding it at rest, at the level of his ribs. And he was looking at her, not sidelong, not with the careful 3/4 aversion that had governed every exchange between them for 6 weeks. Directly, full on, grey and unhurried. And there was something in the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile and had no business being anywhere near one. Neither of them said anything. Hermione felt her own chin come up. She felt the file shift against her ribs. She was aware, with a clarity that bordered on the hallucinatory, of the sound of the urn ticking as it cooled, and of the smell of the room. Burnt tea, old sugar, the faint scorched copper tang of the warming charm on the tin. Draco raised the biscuit, and, without once letting go of her eyes, bit it exactly in half. Malfoy. Granger. He chewed. He swallowed. He set the lid back on the tin with great care, aligning it, and the small, tinny click of it was the loudest sound in the ministry. Was there something? That, she said, was mine. Was it labelled? It was 11 o'clock. Ah. He considered this with every appearance of gravity. You'll want to legislate. I'd suggest a schedule of protected periods with a rebuttable presumption in favour of the first claimant, though of course the drafting would need to survive Perkins, and Perkins takes his at 9. He turned to go, and paused in the doorway, and the remaining half of the biscuit went into his coat pocket in a movement so smooth she nearly missed it. You should come earlier. I have never come earlier. I have come at 11 for 6 years. I know, said Draco, and left. Hermione stood alone in the tea-room with the urn ticking and her file under her arm, and her face going slowly and infuriatingly hot, and she thought, he knows what time I come for a biscuit. She thought, how long has he known? She thought, with a lurch that had nothing to do with sugar, he was waiting for me. The half-biscuit appeared on her desk at 12:10 on a clean square of blotting paper while she was in the archive. There was no note. There was never a note when it mattered. That was the grammar of the thing. Just the half, set precisely in the centre of the paper, with the broken edge turned away from her, so that from her chair it looked whole. She sat down and looked at it for a long time. Then she ate it, and it tasted like nothing at all, and she put the blotting paper in the second drawer with the rest. The bill went to committee at the end of the month, which meant nights. Everybody in the department had known it was coming since October, in the way one knows about weather at sea. What it meant in practice was that from the 24th of November, the legal codification division was inhabited past 9, past 10, past the hour when the corridor lamps dimmed themselves down to the low blue emergency burn, and the whole floor took on the aspect of a ship's hold. Dark timber, small pools of light, the endless soft granular hiss beyond the glass. It also meant that a great deal of the paper traffic stopped, because when two people are working the same document at the same table, notes become absurd. They began to talk. It happened by degrees, and both of them pretended not to notice. On the first night, it was 6 sentences, all of them about the placement of a proviso. On the second, it was rather more, and one of them was not about the proviso at all. On the fourth night, Hermione heard herself say at 10:30, with her shoes off and her feet tucked up under her in a chair that was not hers. The trouble is that Ferrenby was a coward, and heard him say, without looking up, Ferrenby was a bureaucrat, which is a different animal and rather more dangerous, because a coward at least knows what he is. You've read the whole judgment. I've read the whole judgment 9 times. I catalogued the Ferrenby bequest for 2 years. He turned a page. There are 412 boxes of that man's correspondence in the archives, and I read a great deal of it, and I can tell you that his hesitation over the standing point had nothing to do with law and everything to do with his brother-in-law's interest in a hippogriff farm in Wiltshire. Hermione put her cup down. That's not in the literature. No, Draco agreed. It's in box 307. She stared at him across the pool of lamplight. You've been sitting on that since October. I've been sitting on it since 4. Nobody asked. He glanced up then, briefly, and the grey of his eyes in that light was almost warm, which was an intolerable thing to notice at 10:30 at night. You're asking. I'm asking now. Yes, he said. You are. They worked until 1. It became a habit, and the habit became something with a shape to it. 6:30, the floor emptying. 7, the lamps going low. Somewhere around 8, without either of them proposing it, the 2 chairs migrating to the long table under the window, the papers spreading, the 6 feet of parquet quietly abolished. By the first week of December, they had stopped pretending it was 6 feet. She learned things. She learned that he drank his tea scalding and black, and that he could not abide the departmental sugar. She learned that when he was thinking, he turned the signet ring on his little finger, round and round, the flat of it catching the lamp, and that when he was thinking about something that troubled him, he stopped turning it and pressed it hard against the pad of his thumb until the skin went white around the silver. She learned that he had a scar across the back of his right hand, thin and pale, that he never explained and she never asked about. She learned that he could work 11 hours without complaint, and that at the 12th he became, very quietly, extremely funny. She learned that he never mentioned the war, not once, not obliquely. There was a whole shape in the middle of every conversation they had, and both of them walked around it with the practiced courtesy of people navigating a hole in a floor. And he learned things about her, and she knew he was learning them, And that was somehow far worse. He knew when she needed tea before she did. He knew she could not think properly with her sleeves down, and had begun, without comment, to be already turning his own cuffs back by the time she reached hers. He knew that when she got stuck, she would begin to plait a piece of her hair at the temple, and undo it, and plait it again. And once, on a bad night around midnight, he had simply said, "Read it aloud," without preamble. And she had, and the flaw had come out of the clause the moment it hit the air, and neither of them had remarked on how he had known. On the 9th of December, they found the mistake. It was hers. That was the thing. It was in clause 22, the part she had drafted alone in 4, and had carried through every version since, like a stone in a shoe she had stopped feeling. And it was fatal. A cross-reference to a subsection that the Wizengamot had repealed 18 months earlier, and nobody, in 3 rounds of review, had caught. Hermione found it at 11 at night, with the whole table spread in front of her, and she went very cold and very quiet, and did not say a word for 4 minutes. "Granger!" "It's 18 months, she said. Her voice came out flat. 18 months of this thing sitting in committee with a hole in it. If it had gone to the floor like that, Perkins would have... She stopped. Her hands had gone to her cuffs and were smoothing them, over and over, though the linen was flat and cold and perfectly straight. It would have been struck out. All of it. Not the clause. All of it. 6 years. "Yes," he said. "It would." "You're not going to tell me it's fine." "It isn't fine." He was already reaching across the table, drawing the page towards him, uncapping his ink. "It's a 2-hour repair, and we have 4. Give me the repeal schedule." She did not move. "Granger." He looked up. "The repeal schedule. It's behind you, second shelf, right hand, where you keep the things you use weekly, which I know because I put them there once and you put them back, and you were correct, and I was showing off." A beat. "Give it to me." Hermione turned and got the schedule and put it into his hand, and her fingers were shaking so badly that the boards rattled, and he took it and did not comment on the shaking, and that mercy nearly undid her more than the error had. They worked. It took 3 hours and 11 minutes. At 2:10 in the morning, he wrote the last cross-reference in and blotted it and sat back. And the two of them looked at the repaired page in the small amber pool of the lamp, with the enormous dark of the ministry pressing on the windows all around. And something in Hermione's chest let go all at once. "Thank you," she said. He did not answer. "Malfoy, I said thank you. I heard you." He was turning the ring, round and round, and then stopped and pressed. "Don't." "Why not?" "Because you'd have found it," he said. "You did find it. I held a schedule." He stood abruptly and began gathering pages that did not need gathering, and his movements had lost their exactness for the first time in 6 weeks. "You have a habit of being grateful for things people owe you, and it's..." He stopped. "It's what?" "Difficult to be near," said Draco. The lamp hissed. Hermione stood too, without deciding to, and the table was between them, and then it was not, because she had come round the end of it, and there was perhaps a foot of dark air left, and she could see the pulse going in his throat above the collar. "I'm going to ask you something," she said. "I'd rather you didn't. You've been driving me out of my mind since September." "That," said Draco very quietly, "is not a question." No, she agreed, and she reached out, slowly, giving him every possible moment to move, and he did not move, and closed her hand around his wrist, over the linen, over the pulse, and held it. He did not pull away. That was the first thing, and for 3 full seconds, it was the only thing in the world. The fine linen under her palm, the heat coming through it, the ridge of bone at the base of his hand, and beneath that, absurd and undeniable, the hammering of a pulse far too fast for a man standing perfectly still. Then he said, "Granger," in a voice that had been sanded down to nothing, and Hermione let go. She let go and stepped back, and the foot of dark air between them became 2 feet, and then 4, and the room came back. The papers, the lamp, the enormous sleeping weight of the ministry overhead, the hiss of weather that had never once been real. "It's past 2, he said. "Yes." "You'll want to go home." "Yes," said Hermione, and did not move. He gathered the pages. He squared them against the table with 2 sharp raps that were louder than they needed to be, and he put them in the folder, and he fastened the folder, and every one of those motions was a fraction off from the economy she'd grown used to, and she watched all of them and said nothing. At the door, he stopped with his hand on the frame. He did not turn round. "I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen," he said, "but I'd take it as a kindness if you didn't make me discuss it at 2 in the morning." "All right. Thank you." The door coughed shut behind him. Hermione stood alone under the false window, with her hands still faintly warm, and the whole vast building ticking and settling around her, and she thought, he said he wouldn't pretend. She thought, that is the most reckless thing he has ever done. The storm came on the Thursday. It was not weather, whatever the prophet said afterwards. It was a warding failure in the sub-basements, 3 levels of old containment charms letting go in sequence, like buttons off a coat. And what came through the breach was raw and directionless, and stank of ozone. The alarm went at 4 in the afternoon, a low brass note in the walls that everybody over 30 recognized in their spine before they recognized it in their ears. By 4:30, the lifts had locked. By 5, the level 4 corridors were sealed, and the department had been herded up and out through the atrium, and Hermione Granger was not among them, because at 4:10 she had gone down to the archive stacks for box 307. She got as far as the 4th aisle before the lights went blue. "Don't." She turned. He was at the head of the aisle with his wand already up and a folder under his arm, and the emergency burn had drained every colour out of him but the grey. "Malfoy. Don't go back that way. The stair door's gone. It's sealed 9 seconds ago." He came down the aisle towards her, unhurried, and she noticed that his stride was measured deliberately slow, and understood that it was for her benefit, and resented it, and was obscurely grateful for it. The east stair holds for 4 hours. This one didn't, which means we sit down and wait for maintenance, and maintenance is currently 400 people in an atrium. How long? 2 hours, 3. Hermione lowered her wand. Her heart was going, but not from fear. The archive was the safest room in the building, and she knew it. 6 feet of enchanted stone on all sides, and no aperture but the one that had just closed. What was making her pulse skip was something else entirely, and it had walked down the aisle towards her with its cuffs turned back. "Why were you down here?" "You were down here," said Draco. The words sat in the blue air between the shelves. "I mean," he said more evenly, "that the register said Granger, 4:10 p.m, and I looked at the register and I came down. It isn't complicated. It isn't nothing, either." "No," he agreed. "Sit down. The floor's warmer than it looks." They sat. The archive at level 9 was a cathedral of paper. It ran further than the eye could carry in the low light, rank on rank of shelving in oiled black oak, 12 feet high, packed to the boards with boxes and bound volumes and the tied bundles of 2 centuries of Wizengamot correspondence. And the smell of it was extraordinary. The dry, sweetish must of old rag paper, the vanilla ghost of decaying glue, dust that had been lying in the same places since before either of them was born. Beneath it all, faint and metallic, the ozone tang of the breach 3 floors below, like the taste of a coin held on the tongue. They sat side by side with their backs to the shelving, and the aisle running away from them into blue dark. And for 20 minutes, neither of them said anything at all. Then Hermione said, "Why do you do it?" The silence that followed had a different quality. "You'll have to be specific." "No, I won't." She kept her eyes on the aisle ahead. The books first. Then the ink, every morning for 3 weeks, an inch, half an inch, nothing at all on that Monday, which was worse. Then the notes, 41 of them. Malfoy, I counted, and there is not one error in your work in 6 years of archive minutes. I checked, I went and checked. I know you checked. And then the biscuit and the tea, and knowing what time I come down the corridor, and knowing which shelf I keep the repeal schedule on. Her voice was not entirely level, and she did not care. You have never once insulted me. You have never once flirted with me. You have never done one single thing I could take to a panel. And you have driven me to the edge of my own reason since the 10th of September, and I want to know why. The dust turned in the blue light. "Because it makes you look at me," said Draco. Hermione turned her head. He was sitting with his forearms on his knees and his hands loose between them, and he was looking at the floor, and the line of his jaw was rigid. "That's it," he said. "That's the whole of it. You can have it. When I came into that department, you looked through me. Not at through. 6 years of that, from everyone, and I had made my peace with it. It's the arrangement, and I don't complain about the arrangement. And then I moved your books, and you came in the next morning, and you looked at me, and I have never in my life wanted anything the way I wanted the second time you did that. You could have spoken to me." "And said what?" The words came out with an edge for the first time. "Good morning, Granger. I've read everything you've published, including the piece in 3 that nobody read twice, and the piece on hybrid standing 4 times, and I know your handwriting better than my mother's. That was the choice. That or an inch of ink." He looked up at last. "Which of those 2 conversations were you prepared to have in September?" She said nothing. "Precisely," said Draco. "So you built something I couldn't report. I built something you could walk away from." His hand had gone to the signet ring and stopped and pressed. "There's a difference, and it matters, and I'd be obliged if you'd credit me with it. Every note is deniable. Every one. If you had ever come in one morning and put your books back and said nothing more about it, There would have been no incident, no complaint, no scene, nothing for anybody to say about you in a corridor. You'd have lost nothing. The pressure of the silver had gone white around his thumb. I have a great many faults, and I've catalogued most of them, but I did not intend to cost you anything. And what did you stand to lose? He did not answer. Malfoy. Don't, he said quietly. You built an entire architecture so that I could refuse you without consequence, said Hermione. And you don't get to be reticent about the price of it now. What did it cost you? The archive hummed. Somewhere below them, the breach shifted, and the whole floor gave a low, sympathetic groan, and the dust came down in a fine, slow curtain through the blue. Everything I had, said Draco, which is not, as it happens, a great deal, so don't look like that. Like what? Like you're going to be kind to me. Hermione moved before she thought about it. She got up onto her knees and turned, and there was no aisle anymore, no distance, nothing but the dark oak at his back and the pale, rigid line of him against it, and she put her hand flat on his chest over the linen and felt what was happening underneath it. I'm not being kind, she said. His hand came up and closed over hers, not to move it, to hold it there, pressed, and his fingers were cold and shaking very slightly, and she felt every one of them. Granger, you said you wouldn't pretend. I'm not pretending. His head had gone back against the shelving, and his eyes were shut, and his throat worked once. I am asking you to consider, for 1 minute, out loud, what it will look like. Not to me, to you, in the corridor, in the prophet. They will not write that you chose someone. They will write that something was done to you, and they will keep writing it, and every good thing you have built in that department for 6 years will be read backwards through it. Stop. And I am not worth the... Stop. She had leaned in. She had not decided to. There was simply no space left, and his eyes had come open, and they were an inch apart in the dust and the blue and the enormous silence of 200 years of paper. You have spent 5 months, said Hermione unsteadily, telling me things without saying them, and I have understood every single one, and you have never once given me the credit of assuming I could weigh a cost. Don't start being a coward at 9 floors down. His breath went out of him. Say it then, he said. Say something I can't misread. I have been reading you in inches for 5 months, and I cannot do it anymore. So say it plainly, or move back. But for the love of God, don't stay there, while I... The lights came up. All of them at once, the full brass burn of the archive, 300 lamps down the aisles going gold in the same second, and the sealed door at the head of the stacks let out a shriek of iron as its wards released, and somewhere far off, a voice shouted, "Level 9 clear!" Hermione did not move. Draco's hand was still over hers, flat on his chest, and neither of them moved at all while the footsteps came nearer down the aisle, and she looked at him in the gold light and said very clearly, "Wait for me at 8. He did not wait for her at 8. She knew it before she reached the door. There is a particular sound an occupied room makes, a change in the way the air holds itself, and the legal codification division at 8 o'clock that evening had none of it. She stood in the corridor with her hand on the cold brass and made herself turn the handle anyway, because she had said, "Wait for me." And a woman who says that, to a man, has an obligation to walk in and see whether he did. The lamps were out. The chairs were pushed in. On the long table under the window there was nothing but the wood. His desk was immaculate, blotter squared, quills laid in their rank, the silver-topped inkwell dead centre, stoppered, and beside it the Ferrenby folder tied with its tape and set at a perfect right angle to the edge of the desk, with a note on top in his own hand. Granger, clauses 22 through 29, completed and cross-checked against the repeal schedule. Committee copy fair written, nothing outstanding. DM. She read it 4 times, looking for the error. There was no error. The grammar was flawless. The punctuation was flawless. The possessives were where possessives belonged, and every apostrophe stood exactly where the language required it. And there was not one thing in those 31 words that could not have been written by a stranger to a stranger. Hermione put it down and stood in the dark office for a very long time. He came at 10 to 8 the next morning, as he always did. "Granger! Malfoy!" He sat. He unrolled the blotter. The quill began its patient stopping and starting, and outside the window that opened onto nothing, the false rain went on running down the glass in its long grey threads. And by 9:30, Hermione understood that something had been taken away from her with surgical precision, and that she had no idea how to ask for it back, because it was all gone. The ink stood where she had left it. She checked at 8 and at 11 and at 4, and each time the 3 bottles sat in their rank exactly as she had set them the night before, the facets throwing their small identical sparks, untouched, unmoved, insultingly obedient. The books held their illegible order. The memoranda came, 6 that day, 9 the next, and they were models of departmental correspondence. Attached, the revised schedule. Your note received? Agreed. This paragraph is defensible. The previous one is not. Correct. Courteous. Cold as a stone off a moor. She read each one twice with the red inkwell open at her elbow and the nib dry in her hand, and there was nothing to correct, nothing to answer, nothing to send back. And after the 4th she stopped the red and did not open it again. On the Wednesday she went down the corridor at 11 and the tin was empty, and Perkins was licking sugar off his thumb by the urn, and she stood at the window and looked at grey nothing for 4 minutes and went back to her desk. He was not cruel. That was the intolerable part. He did not avoid her. He was in the room 10 hours a day, 6 feet away. He answered every question fully. When she asked about box 307, he told her about box 307, precisely, generously, at length, and gave her 2 other boxes she had not thought to ask for. And she sat with a list of Ferrenby's private correspondence in her hand and felt as though she had been handed a beautifully wrapped parcel by a man behind glass. He had gone back behind the arrangement. He had heard "Wait for me" at 8 in the gold light of the archive with 3 witnesses coming up the aisle, and he had done the arithmetic she had told him not to do, and he had decided. He was letting her walk away without consequence. He was doing it for her, and he had not asked. And by the end of the 2nd week, Hermione Granger was so angry she could barely hold a quill. She tried, twice. The first time was on the Thursday at 6:30, when the floor had emptied. She got as far as standing up. She got as far as the middle of the parquet with a folder in her hand and her heart going like a bird in a box. and he looked up with his face perfectly composed and said, "Is that the transitional provisions?" And she said, "Yes," and gave him the folder and went and sat down. The second time was worse. She wrote it. She sat at her desk at 9 at night with the red ink open and wrote 3 lines on a clean sheet in her own upright hand, saying the thing plainly, saying it in words no reasonable person could misread. And then she looked at what she had written and understood, with a horror that made her ears ring, that she had produced a document. Something with a date on it, something that would exist in the world whether or not he wanted it to. Something he would have to answer or fail to answer, and either way, it would be evidence. He had spent 5 months building her an exit that cost her nothing. She had very nearly repaid him by handing him a letter he could be ruined by. Hermione burned it in the lamp flame and watched the ash curl and thought, no, not in words. He never once used words. And then, quite suddenly, sitting there in the amber light with her fingertips black, she saw the whole shape of it, the grammar, the syntax, the entire 5-month architecture of the thing. And her breath went out of her in something that was very nearly a laugh. He had taught her a language. He had taught her a language and then stopped speaking it. And she had been standing in the silence for a fortnight, waiting to be addressed like a girl at a dance, when she had been fluent since October. She reached out and picked up the black inkwell. She held it for a moment. Then she set it down 2 inches to the left of its place. Not 1, 2, unmistakable, no accident possible, and turned the stopper so its facets caught the lamp at an angle no habit of hers had ever produced. She looked at it. Then she got up and went to her shelves and took down Crow, 3rd edition, from the top rank where Crow belonged, and put it at eye level in the weekly place. Wrong. Deliberately, gloriously wrong, in a system only 2 people in the building could read. Then she went home, and for the first time in 14 days, she slept. She arrived at 7 the next morning, with her pulse in her throat. The black inkwell stood 2 inches left, exactly where she had put it. Crow sat at eye level. Nothing had moved. At 10 to 8, the door coughed. "Granger. Malfoy." He crossed the parquet. He set down his case. And Hermione, with her eyes fixed on a page of transitional provisions she could not have read under torture, heard his footsteps stop, not at his desk, 2 paces short of it. The silence went on for 4 seconds, 5. She did not look up. She counted her own heartbeats and got to 11, and then heard him move again and sit and unroll the blotter and begin to write. Nothing else happened all day. At 6, he rose, fastened his cuffs, said, "Granger," and left. She waited until the corridor lamps went blue. Then she turned to her shelf. Crow, 3rd edition, had been returned to the top rank where Crow belonged. And in the place where she had put it, the weekly place, at eye level, right hand, stood a slim volume in cracked buckram that had never been on her shelves in her life, with a marker of green ribbon at page 409. Hermione took it down with hands that would not behave. Journal of Comparative Magical Jurisprudence, Spring. 3. His own copy. The spine cracked white with use in 3 places, the corners furred soft, the whole thing carrying the sweetish dry dust smell of the level 9 stacks. Page 409, standing at the threshold, by H. J. Granger. The margins were black with his hand. 22 years of it, in 3 different inks. Arguments, objections, a whole running quarrel with her, sentence by sentence, in that fine forward-leaning copperplate. This is too generous to Ferrenby. No. See Bracknell, 1961. She has this backwards, and then 4 lines down, in a different ink and a later hand. She does not have this backwards. I did. At page 422, beside the 4-stage test, an annotation dated in the margin, September 1st. Reread. Still the best thing written on this in a century. And beneath it, undated, in ink so recent it had barely browned. She will never be told this by anyone who matters, because the people who matter did not read it. D. Hermione sat down on the floor of the Legal Codification Division with her back against the shelving and the journal open on her knees, and read her own paper through a stranger's 22 years, and did not notice for some minutes that she was crying. She was still there at 7:30 when the door coughed. He stopped in the doorway. He had his coat on and his gloves in one hand, and the look that went over his face when he saw where she was sitting and what she was holding was the first entirely unguarded thing she had ever seen him do. I left my... He stopped. That was not meant to be read tonight, wasn't it? Her voice came out wrecked. When, then? Never, ideally. He had not moved from the doorway. I meant you to see the ribbon and understand that I had read the paper, which you already knew, and put it back, and we would go on, and it would be deniable. Yes. You put it on my shelf. Hermione got up. The journal was still open in her hands, and she did not close it. In the weekly place, where I would reach without looking every week for years. Explain to me how that is deniable. He said nothing. You moved my ink for 3 weeks, she said, and stopped for a fortnight. And the fortnight was worse than anything you have ever done to me, including 1994. Do you know what I did last night? I moved it myself, 2 inches, because you would not, and because I have spent 2 weeks learning that I would rather be driven out of my mind by you than left alone in peace by anybody else in this building. Granger, I'm not finished. She came around the desk. You decided for me. In the archive, with 3 men coming up the aisle, you did the arithmetic, and you decided what it would cost me, and you took the decision out of my hands, and you called it courtesy, and it was the single most arrogant thing you have ever done. He had gone white. I said, wait for me at 8, said Hermione, and her voice cracked straight through the middle of it. You weren't there. No, said Draco. Why? Because I would not have been able to leave, he said, and dropped his gloves and crossed the room. He stopped a foot away. That was the thing about him. Even then, even with his gloves on the floor behind him, and his face stripped of every arrangement he had ever made, he stopped short and left the last foot for her. She understood it at once. It was the same architecture as the ink and the notes, and the biscuit set down on blotting paper with the broken edge turned away. Here is the whole of it, and you may still walk out of the room, and nothing will have happened. Hermione closed the journal and set it on the desk, and used the last foot. His hands came up to her face, as though he had done it 1,000 times in his head, and never once with his hands, and one of them was in her hair and one at her jaw. and the pad of his thumb went along her cheekbone through the wet there, and she heard him make a sound low in his throat that had nothing to do with speech. "Say it," he said. "Plainly. You didn't in the archive." "I'm not going to say it," said Hermione, and she took a fistful of his collar and pulled him down. The first touch of his mouth was almost nothing, a question held, barely landing, and then her hand slid up into his hair and it stopped being a question altogether. She felt the moment his restraint went, felt it come apart in the muscle of his shoulders under her palm, in the arm that went round her waist and took her off the floor by 1/2 an inch and set her against the edge of the desk, in the way his mouth opened over hers with something like grief in it. He tasted of cold air and black tea. His ring was a hard, flat bite of silver against the nape of her neck, and she would remember that detail for the rest of her life, that one small cold thing in the middle of all that heat. Somewhere behind them, a stack of transitional provisions slid off the desk and went across the parquet in a long white fan, and neither of them so much as turned their head. When he broke away, he did not go far. His forehead came down against hers, and they stayed like that, breathing badly, 6 inches from a bottle of black ink standing 2 deliberate inches out of true. 14 days, she said. "I know. You let me stand in an empty office at 8 o'clock. I know." His thumb moved once along her jaw. "I stood in the corridor until past. I want that on the record." "There is no record." "No," said Draco. "There isn't." And he kissed her again, slower, with his hand flat between her shoulder blades, and the amber lamp hissed, and the false rain came down the false glass, and the Legal Codification Division of the Ministry of Magic held its breath around them for a long, long while. The winter ministerial was on the 19th of December, and everybody had to go. It was held in the atrium with the fountain dry and hung with silver, and 400 people in dress robes standing about on the black marble under a ceiling, charmed to a clear frost-blue night, and the great fireplaces roaring green all evening as more of them arrived. String music from somewhere behind the portkey office, elf-made wine going round on trays. It was, as it was every year, 3 hours of pure occupational endurance, and Hermione had spent 6 of them and had a system for that too. She saw him at 9:10 across the whole width of the atrium, and everything in her chest turned over like a page. They had agreed nothing. That was the terrible, exhilarating fact of the 8 days since. They had not discussed it once. Not the corridor, not the prophet, not what happened on Monday morning in a department with no partitions. They had simply worked and gone home separately. And on 3 of those 8 evenings, he had come to her flat at 9:30 and stayed until 1. And on all 3 of them, the drafting had got done, and on none of them had either of them said the word "this" out loud. He was standing with the Wizengamot Archives people near the second fireplace. Black robes, no ornament but the signet. He inclined his head perhaps 1/4 of an inch, and she inclined hers, and that was the entire visible transaction, and her ears were hot for 10 minutes afterwards. At 10:30, she was cornered by Perkins. He had been at the wine since 8, and had reached the stage of the evening at which a certain kind of man becomes confiding. He wanted to talk about subsection 9. He wanted, in particular to talk about how well it had gone through committee and how he had always said the standing point had legs, and Hermione stood with her glass and made the noises one makes. And then he said, "Of course, one does wonder about your new man." "I beg your pardon?" "Malfoy." Perkins swirled his wine. "Extraordinary drafter, I'll grant you. But Merlin's beard, Granger, in your department. Of all the, I mean to say, one remembers things. One remembers what that family was. I said to Dawlish, I said, there's a woman with a memory shorter than her—" "Finish that sentence," said Hermione. Perkins blinked. "I only meant—" "No, please. You were going to say something about my memory." She had not raised her voice at all. She had lowered it, and 3 conversations nearby had gone quiet, and a 4th was going. "I have an excellent memory. Would you like to test it? I remember every clause of the part-human standing bill. I remember which of them were drafted by whom. 22 of the 31 are mine. 6 are his. The remaining 3 were repaired at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 9th of December, after I made an error that would have destroyed 6 years of work, and they were repaired by Draco Malfoy, who had no obligation to be in that building and who has never once claimed the credit in this room or any other." The atrium had got noticeably quieter in a 10-foot radius. "Now," said Hermione, "since we are remembering, in 2004 the Wizengamot Archives produced a report on part-human petitions. Footnote 16 of that report cited a paper on graduated legal personality that nobody in this ministry had read, and that citation is the reason the standing argument existed in a usable form when the bill was drawn. Archival staff don't sign their work, so it took me 5 months to find out who wrote it. Would you like to guess, Perkins? You had 19 years to read that paper. He read it 4 times. I hardly think—" "No," she agreed. "You hardly did. And I'll tell you the rest of it, since we're being confiding." She set her glass down on the rim of the dry fountain with a small, clear click. "You said in committee, in October, that graduated personality wasn't in the literature. He corrected you with the page reference. You have not read a journal since you were 30, and you have built a career on the assumption that nobody will ever check. And a man you consider beneath your notice has been checking for 2 decades in a basement with no name on any of it. I would think about that if I were you. I would think about it quite hard." She turned. He was standing 8 feet away with a glass in his hand and an expression she had never seen on him. Not the composed one, not the stripped one from the office doorway, but something raw and wholly disbelieving, as though the floor of the atrium had gone out from under him. Behind her, Perkins said something about how he had merely been making an observation. Hermione did not hear it. She walked past him, past the archives people, past 2 Wizengamot clerks who had turned to stare, and she stopped in front of Draco Malfoy in the middle of 400 people under a frost-blue ceiling, and said, clearly enough to be heard, "I'm going out for air. Come with me." And she did not wait to see whether he followed, because she knew. The atrium terrace was not really a terrace. It was a flagged ledge behind the visitor's entrance, 20 feet long, enclosed by a parapet and open to a strip of London sky, and nobody used it in December. It was raining. Real rain. The first real rain either of them had stood in for months, coming down thin and cold and diagonal, smelling of wet stone and soot and the river, entirely unlike the endless, perfect hiss of the thing behind the office glass. It went through her hair in seconds. She did not care. The door swung shut behind him. "You shouldn't have done that," said Draco. "I know exactly what I should and shouldn't have done." "Granger?" 22 years. She turned on him. The rain was running off her jaw. 22 years of reading me in a basement and correcting yourself in the margins and letting Perkins stand there in his waistcoat and be wrong out loud, and never once. That was not for the atrium. It was precisely for the atrium. He had come forward 2 steps without seeming to know it. The rain had flattened his hair and darkened the shoulders of his robes, and his hands were open at his sides. "Do you know what they'll write?" he said, and his voice was not steady. "Not tomorrow. Thursday. Granger's curious defense. And then somebody will remember Wiltshire. And then somebody will remember the drawing room. And it will be your name in it every single time. And I have spent 5 months. 5 months building me a door I could leave by. Yes, I've noticed." She took hold of his lapels with both hands, and the wet wool was cold and rough under her fingers. "I don't want the door, Malfoy. I have never wanted the door. I have spent my whole life being told what things will cost me by people who never once asked whether I decided they were worth it, and I will not take that from you as well. It isn't a fair trade. It isn't a trade at all." Her hands had fisted in his lapels, and she pulled, and he came, and there was no distance left. "You put your journal on my shelf in the weekly place. You knew what that meant. Don't you dare stand here in the rain and pretend you were being modest." His hands came up and closed over her wrists. "Say it plainly," he said. "You still haven't. Not once." The rain came down. 9 floors below them, the ministry roared on, green fire and string music, and up here there was nothing but stone and water and the cold white spill of a lamp over the parapet. "I'm in love with you," said Hermione Granger. "There. Plainly. I have been since October, and I knew it at the 9th of December, and I'd have said it in the archive if you'd waited 4 more seconds, and I am not going to say it twice, so—" She got no further, because he had let go of her wrists and taken her face in both hands, and the rest of it went into his mouth. The prophet ran it on Thursday as he had said it would. Not on the front page. The front page belonged to a cauldron-bottom scandal in Hogsmeade. But on page 5, 3 columns, with a photograph of the atrium taken from the mezzanine, in which 2 figures were just distinguishable near the second fireplace, one of them turning to look at their other with an expression that no reasonable person could have described as professional. "A curious defense," said the headline. Hermione read it standing up in her kitchen at 7 in the morning, with her coffee going cold beside her, and by the 3rd paragraph she found she was not angry at all. It was worse than she had feared in the particulars, and better than she had feared in the whole. There was the drawing room, as promised. There was Wiltshire. There was a sentence about the peculiar susceptibility of women of great intellect to men of great charm that made her want to set the paper alight in her own sink. And there was, buried in the 4th column where the writer had plainly not understood what she had been given, a full and accurate account of footnote 16 of the 2004 Archives report and of who had written it. She folded the paper. She arrived at the ministry at 7, as she always did. He was already there. That, in itself, was unprecedented. In 4 months, he had never once beaten her to the department. He was standing at the long table under the window, with his coat still on and his back to the door. And when he turned, she saw that he had not slept and had not shaved, and had a copy of the Prophet in his hand, and that he had folded it to page 5. "Granger," he said, "you should... If the next words out of your mouth are anything at all about giving me an exit," said Hermione, closing the door behind her, "I will hex you in a government building." His mouth did something complicated. "I was going to say," he said, "that you should look at the 4th column." "I have looked at the 4th column. They printed it." "They printed it," she agreed. He put the paper down on the table with great care, as though it might go off, and stood with his hand flat on it, and did not look up. In the amber lamplight, the shadows under his eyes were violet. 19 years, he said, and it took a gossip column. "It took me," said Hermione, "which I would like noted." That got her a laugh, a short, disbelieving exhalation, hardly a laugh at all, but she had heard him make that sound perhaps 4 times in 5 months, and each one felt like a coin found in a coat pocket. Then he reached into his coat and brought out a box. It was not large. Black lacquer, hinged, the size of a loaf, with a fine crack across one corner that had been mended a long time ago with silver. He set it on the table between them and stepped back from it, the whole width of a step, hands at his sides, ceding it entirely. "This was going to be a great deal easier when I thought I'd be doing it in 10 years, he said. Hermione opened it. Paper. It was full of paper, packed close and squared, and for a moment she did not understand what she was seeing. Then she lifted the top sheet out and saw her own upright hand in red, and the word yours written above your, and the date in the corner in his fine copper plate, September 18th. Everyone. Every memorandum she had ever sent back to him, from the first to the last, in order, dated. 41 of them. The one where she had written, "I am beginning to suspect a pattern." The one from the November committee week, where she had drawn a line through definitely so hard she had gone through the parchment, and beneath the tear he had written, in pencil, in a hand smaller than she had ever seen him use. She pressed hard here, and at the bottom of the box, under the whole weight of it, a bound manuscript. She lifted it out, 200 pages, handwritten in 3 inks. On the first sheet, part human standing bill, alternative draft, all clauses, with schedules and transitionals. Begun June 14th, completed December 8th. "Begun June," said Hermione. "Yes." "You transferred in September." "Yes," said Draco. She turned the pages. Clause 22 was there. Her clause, the one with the fatal cross-reference. And it had been repaired, and the repair was dated the 21st of June, 5 months and 18 days before the two of them had sat at that table until 2:10 in the morning, putting it right together. Hermione put the manuscript down on the table very slowly. "You knew," she said. "On the 9th of December, you knew where the error was." "Yes." "You sat there for 3 hours and 11 minutes and let me find it." "You found it in 4 minutes," said Draco. "I let you fix it. There is a difference, and it is the only decent thing I have done in this building." He had gone to the ring and pressed. It was your bill. If I had walked into that department in September with 200 pages of corrections to 6 years of your work, what precisely do you imagine that would have been? A gift? His voice frayed at the edge. It would have been the loudest possible way of telling you that I thought you needed help. So I put it in a box, and I moved your ink, and I waited to be asked. And if I had never asked? Then it would have stayed in the box, he said, and the bill would have failed in committee in the spring, and I would have found some anonymous way to get the repeal point in front of somebody, and you would never have known, and that would have been... He stopped. Say it. Acceptable, said Draco. It would have been acceptable. I had made my peace with acceptable. And then you put Crow on the wrong shelf, and I have not had a peaceful hour since, and I find I don't want one. Hermione crossed the parquet. She did not stop a foot away. She had learned that much. She had learned the whole grammar of it by now, every dialect and inflection, and she knew that he would stop short every time and leave her the room to refuse, and that the answer to it was simply not to. She took his face in her hands. There was stubble under her palms, and the skin was cold from being outdoors too long. 6 years, she said. I built something in this department. Do you know what I had at the end of it? An orderly shelf and a bill that nobody would move. Then you came in and reordered my books, and I spent 2 hours putting them back, and I was more alive that night than I had been since the war. Her thumbs moved along his cheekbones. You didn't drive me mad, Malfoy. You woke me up. There's a difference, and I've had 5 months to work out which it was, and I'm quite good at this sort of analysis. Granger, kiss me before somebody comes in at 8. He did. It was slower than the rain and slower than the office, and it had no grief in it at all, and his hands were in her hair and hers were fisted in his coat, and when the door coughed at 10 to 8, it was Mafalda Hopkirk who came in and stopped dead and went straight back out again, and neither of them let go for a full 4 seconds afterwards. The bill passed on the 22nd of March. It went through the Wizengamot at the 3rd reading by a margin of 11, and Clause 22 held. And the standing test at page 422 of a paper nobody had read entered the law of magical Britain word for word, as it had been written 23 years earlier by a girl of 24 who had thought at the time that it was probably too generous to Ferrenby. Perkins voted for it. He made a small speech about the standing point having always had legs. They offered her the headship of the division in April. Robards did it himself in his office, with the door shut and the tea poured, and he talked for 6 minutes about continuity and the confidence of the department before he came to the part he had been circling. There's the other matter, he said. Malfoy. You'd be his line manager, Granger. There are forms. There'd have to be a declaration on the record, and it'd be read by the board, and I won't pretend it wouldn't get out. He turned his cup on its saucer. You could take the post, and I could move him. Archives would have him back tomorrow. Nobody would ever have to write anything down. Hermione looked at him for a moment. No, she said. Where are the forms? Granger. He has spent a year, said Hermione, constructing every possible arrangement by which I could have him without ever admitting to it. He built the whole thing out of deniability, Robards, And he did it because he thought that was the kindest thing available to him, and he was wrong. And I have been correcting his errors since September. She set her cup down. The forms, please. She filled them in that afternoon, at her own desk, in black ink, in her own upright hand, with him sitting 6 feet away, pretending not to watch her, and failing so comprehensively that she had to stop twice. Nature of relationship, she wrote, and paused for perhaps a second and a half. Personal, ongoing, declared voluntarily by both parties. She blotted it and signed it and looked up. "You've gone rather pale," she said. "I'm perfectly well." "You're gripping that desk." "I am," Draco agreed, and let go of it, and pressed his knuckles once against his mouth, and then got up and came round the 6 feet of parquet that no longer existed, and read the form over her shoulder in silence for a long moment. Then he took her quill out of her hand and dipped it and signed underneath, and his signature was as fine and even and unhurried as everything else he had ever written. 10 months later, on a Sunday in February, Hermione Granger came out of her bathroom at 8:30 in the morning, toweling her hair, and stopped in the doorway of her own sitting room. Her shelves ran the whole length of the far wall now. They had had to be extended twice, and the extension had been done badly by a carpenter and well by Draco, who had strong views. The left-hand 3 ranks stood in her own illegible order, weakly at eye level, crow exiled to the top. The right-hand ranks stood in his, alphabetical by author, spines flush to a finger breadth, Abercrombie leading like a soldier all the way down to the collected yarrow. Neither of them had ever once touched the other's half. It was the most stable treaty in magical Britain. On the low table by the window, in the winter light, her 3 inkwells stood in their rank. Black, red, violet, a thumb's width apart, facets catching. The black one was 1 inch out of true. Hermione stood very still with a towel in her hands. Beside it lay a sheet of parchment, and on it, in that fine forward-leaning copper plate, Granger, there's tea in the pot. It has been there 20 minutes, which by your own generous estimate leaves us 3. And underneath, in a hand that had not one error in it, that had never in 23 years permitted itself a single error where it mattered, I have loved you since the spring of 2003, when I read a paper by a woman I had spent my adolescence trying not to think about, and understood on page 422 that she was the finest legal mind of her generation, and that I would never be permitted to tell her so. I have been permitted a great deal more than I deserved since. I should like to ask for one thing further. Will you marry me? Correct it in red if the answer is yes. You always do. D. She turned. He was in the kitchen doorway with 2 cups in his hands, and his cuffs turned back, and an expression of quite catastrophic calm. And the pulse was going visibly in his throat, and he did not say a single word. Hermione dropped the towel. She crossed the room and took the red inkwell and unstoppered it with hands that were shaking so badly she nearly spilled it, and struck through theirs and wrote theirs, and struck through there and wrote there, and struck through your and wrote your, and then at the bottom, in letters pressed harder into the parchment than any she had ever made, she wrote, "Yes, 3 errors, Malfoy, in 1 note. You've never made 3. H.G." She heard the cups go down on the counter behind her. She heard him cross the floor. And then his arms came round her from behind, and his mouth was at the join of her neck and shoulder, and she was laughing and crying at once, and turning in his hold to get her hands into his hair. And the red inkwell went over on the table and ran a long scarlet river across the parchment, and neither of them moved to save it, because it had said what it needed to say in the only language the two of them had ever properly spoken, and there was nothing left in it now worth reading twice. They were married in September in the garden of a house in Kent that neither of them had chosen for any reason, except that it was small and old, and had a wall of climbing roses gone completely feral along the south side. There were 31 people. Ginny cried in the manner of a woman who had spent 11 months insisting she would not. Harry shook Draco's hand for slightly too long and said nothing at all, and Draco, who had prepared for a great many things, had not prepared for that, and had to look at the roses for a moment. Mafalda Hopkirk got quietly drunk on elf-made wine and told anybody who would listen that she had been the one who walked in on them, which was true, and which she considered the great achievement of her career. Perkins was not invited. Hermione had thought about it for nearly 4 seconds. The vows were short. Draco had written his out, of course. He had written them out 11 times in 3 inks, and Hermione had found the discarded drafts in the drawer of his desk in June, and had put them back exactly as she found them, and had never mentioned it. What he said in the end was 6 sentences long, and the 5th of them was, "I spent 23 years reading you, and I got almost everything wrong, and you have been correcting me ever since, and I intend to give you a great deal more to correct." She laughed and cried at the same time, which she had promised herself she would not do, and everybody in the garden saw it. They did not stop. That was the thing that surprised the department. There had been a general expectation, unspoken, that once the thing was declared on a form and read by the board, it would settle, that the two of them would become simply another married couple in the ministry, dull and pleasant, taking their lunch at the same table. Instead, the ink kept moving. Hermione Granger, she kept the name professionally, and he had never once raised it, became head of the legal codification division in the spring, and in 8 years she rewrote more of the statute book than anyone since Ferrenby. And every single morning of those 8 years, she arrived at 7 to find her black inkwell some fraction out of true, and every evening she left with 1 book on the wrong shelf, and neither of them ever once discussed it. And the junior drafters who came into that department believed for years that the head simply had an eccentric habit with her stationery. They found out eventually. Somebody always did. It became the story people told new recruits on their first week, and it was told badly, and neither of them ever corrected it. The Part-Human Standing Act came into force on the 1st of June. They went, the two of them, to the public gallery on the day the first petition was heard under it, a case about a young woman with a claim nobody had ever been able to bring before. They sat at the back. Nobody knew they were there. When the ruling came, Hermione did not move for a long moment. Then she reached over without looking and took his hand and gripped it hard enough to hurt, and he let her and turned the ring round once against her palm. 23 years, she said under her breath. 24, said Draco. You wrote it in 2, You published it in 3. She turned her head and looked at him. How can you possibly know that? Granger, he said. Please. Their daughter was born in the winter, 4 years after the wedding, at 2:30 in the morning, in a snowstorm that shut down half of London. They called her Iris. She had her mother's hair and her father's appalling patience, and by the age of 3, she had worked out entirely on her own that if she moved things very slightly on her mother's desk, her mother would notice and would say nothing and would smile at nothing across the room. And the game became a family institution, played by all 3 of them, with rules nobody had ever written down. Draco taught her to read at 4, and he taught her badly on purpose, 1 word at a time, seeding small errors into everything he wrote for her until she found them herself. "Your is wrong," Iris announced one morning, aged 5, standing on a chair in the kitchen with a note in her fist. "It's yours, Papa. It's yours. You did it wrong." Hermione, in the doorway with a cup of tea, put her hand over her mouth. Draco set down the pan he was holding and crouched and looked at his daughter with an expression of the most profound and complete seriousness. "So I did," he said. "How extraordinary. Would you correct it for me?" "In red?" "Only ever in red," said Draco Malfoy. "That's the rule." The house filled up, as houses do. The shelves ran the whole length of the long room by then and had been extended 4 times. The left ranks in her order illegible, weakly at eye level, crows still exiled to the top. The right ranks in his, alphabetical, flush to a finger breadth. In the middle, where the 2 systems met, there was one shelf that belonged to neither of them, and on it stood a slim volume in cracked buckram with a green ribbon at page 409, and a black lacquer box mended at the corner with silver, and 41 sheets of parchment in red and black, dated in a fine, forward-leaning hand. Iris asked about the box once, when she was 9. "Letters," her mother said. "From who?" "From your father, before I knew I loved him." "What do they say?" Hermione considered that for a while, standing in the winter light with her hand resting on the lid. "Nothing," she said. "That's rather the point of them. They say absolutely nothing at all, in the loveliest possible way, and I read every single word." Across the room, in the chair by the window with the newspaper unread on his knee, Draco did not look up. But he was smiling, and his wife could see it, and after 30 years she had long since stopped needing him to say a thing about it.
So that's the end. Thank you for staying with me. I want to tell you something about writing this one. There is a small moment in part 4. He takes the last biscuit. He looks right at her. He eats half of it, and then, an hour later, he puts the other half on her desk, on a clean piece of paper, with the broken edge turned away, so it looks whole. He says nothing. He never says nothing. I wrote that part twice. The first time I gave him a line, something clever. Then I deleted it because I think that is how real people love each other, not with speeches, with small things, with the half you saved. I thought about that a lot while I writing this. We all wait to be told. We wait for the big words, the perfect sentence, and sometimes it never comes. But someone is making your tea, someone remembers your shelf, someone moves your ink 1 inch every morning just to make you look up. That is a love letter too. We just don't read it. So here is a moral, if there is one. Learn the language of the person in front of you. It may not sound like anything you expected. It may sound like silence. It may look like a mistake in a letter. And if you love someone, please do not decide for them what it will cost. Do not build them a door out of the room. Let them choose. People are stronger than we think. They can carry more than we believe. She chose him out loud, in front of everyone. That was the bravest thing in the whole story. Not the kiss, not the other things. Thank you for listening. Take care of your people and notice the small things. Good night.